Hello and welcome to the Silver King's War. I'm Michael Sievers, the writer, producer, and creator of this podcast series about my father's Second World War as a B-26 Bombardier. Today, as we continue in the epilogue for Dearest Ones, the letters that Stanley wrote to his family throughout the war, we have a special edition that focuses on a man named Glenn L. Martin. Glenn Martin was the man who made the B-26, the Martin Marauder, that Stanley rode in throughout his war. Glenn Martin began his rise through aviation when his family moved to Santa Ana, California in 1905. And the significance of Santa Ana is simply that the Silver King, before bomber school, spent about 1 month at the Santa Ana Army Air Base in June 1943. Stanley had been assigned to the Army Air Force's Western Flying Training Command headquarters at 1104 West 8th Street in Santa Ana, California. And Glenn Martin began his manufacturing process literally blocks from the Army Air Corps headquarters in Santa Ana. Martin, with the help of his mother Minta, built his first plane in a former Methodist church at the corner of 2nd and Main Streets in Santa Ana. When I began to develop the Silver King's War series, of course I had to learn quite a bit about Glenn Martin. And I began learning about him with visits to the Glenn L. Martin Museum in Middle River, Maryland, on the site of the plants that built the B-26 and many other planes that made Martin manufacturing such a great success during World War II. The Martin Museum historians provided me with an enormous amount of material and ideas on where to find other resources, including, of course, the Library of Congress. And my early research led me to a discarded copy of a biography about Glenn L. Martin that had been written by a man named Henry Still, who in 1960 was the news director of Martin Marietta Corporation. This biography was in the Piper High School Library in Kansas City, Kansas. The Martin family, before their move to Santa Ana, lived in Kansas as Glenn's father, Clarence, developed his business as a salesman of farm equipment and hardware. By the time that our hero, the Silver King, arrived in Santa Ana, Glenn Martin was an industrial giant producing planes for the United States Army and the Navy. Martin had been on the cover of Time magazine on May 29, 1939, and in late November of 1942 was the subject of a 2-part profile in the New Yorker magazine by Alva Johnston entitled Hero for Business Reasons. Alva Johnston was a legendary writer for the New Yorker magazine. Johnston's profile of Glenn Martin was published on November 28, 1942, and the following first week in December. This was almost a year after the United States had entered World War II. And much of the New Yorker staff was on assignment overseas covering the Second World War. And those amazing writers included A.J. Liebling and Janet Flanner. Alva Johnston's thorough consideration of Glenn Martin began really in descriptions of the young Martin. And I wanted to share some of how it began. In 1906, the young Martin, then 20, was in the automobile business in Santa Ana, California. After more than a year of preliminary studies, he rented an abandoned church for $12 a month and carried a 15-horsepower Ford motor into it and started building a giant box kite around it. In 1909, he had his plane skipping a few feet off the ground, and in 1910, he was making public flights. For 5 years thereafter, he was winning prizes, breaking records, and capturing front-page headlines. Johnston wrote that by 1915, Martin's spectacular air achievements had given solid commercial value to the name of Glenn L. Martin. And then he retired from public exhibitions and devoted himself entirely to building up the Glenn L. Martin Company. Glenn Martin was born in Macksburg, Iowa, on January 17th, 1886. From there, the family moved to Liberal, Kansas, so that Clarence could try a better venue for his sales of farm equipment. From Liberal, the family moved to Salina, Kansas, and Glenn went to high school and then on to a 2-year business course at Kansas Wesleyan University. It was during those formative years that Glenn's mother, Minta, decided she really couldn't handle the Midwest winters anymore. And so the family moved to Santa Ana, California in 1905. The family bought an apricot ranch in Santa Ana, and Glenn got a bank loan, and he and his father began selling automobiles on Main Street. And then Glenn decided to begin a garage. And not long after that, he read about Orville Wright's flying adventures at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Alva Johnston described Martin's first real step toward the flying business when he built a biplane glider. And over a number of months, Martin was practicing his gliding in the hills near Santa Ana. And when he felt good about what he was doing, he pursued that abandoned Methodist church and began working nights with the help of his mother to build a biplane that had a motor and a propeller. Alva Johnston described Glenn Martin as a man who was busy day and night. During the day, he was selling and repairing automobiles to support himself as he was building his plane. And there he was after work at night in an abandoned space that had neither fuel nor power. It was a little church. And he worked by the light of kerosene, and his mother was often a lead assistant. While building his plane, Martin managed to gain access to the largest lima bean field in the world that was owned by James Irvine. Irvine, who owned 80,000 acres of land around Santa Ana, visited the church to examine the plane. He wasn't sure it was capable of flight, but he was happy to support Glenn Martin. Martin moved his plane to Irvine's land under moonlight, and it wasn't until 4 years later that Martin convinced Irvine to be a passenger in his plane. And Irvine was amazed at what he saw from the air. Johnston wrote that by 1912, Martin was one of the leading exhibition flyers in America. That year, Martin won almost $5,000 in an international meet in Chicago. And later in that same year, he moved his operation from Santa Ana to Los Angeles, where he began a flying school. In 1915, Glenn Martin reached stardom in Hollywood as the hero in a movie called The Girl of Yesterday, which starred Mary Pickford, who agreed to fly with Glenn Martin. As America was facing the daunting future that might include joining World War I, Glenn Martin developed a relationship with the Wright brothers. He was hoping to build bombers. He felt that the future of war and any success the nation might have would be from the air. The Wright brothers' plan didn't work for Glenn Martin, but Martin went on to find backing in Cleveland, and he reorganized his company and built a plant in Cleveland. And in January of 1918, he went to Washington with his plans for a new bomber. Alva Johnston wrote that Martin was competing, of course, with the automobile industry, who thought that they could mass-produce planes. And apparently it wasn't working as they imagined it. So Martin got the chance to produce some models, and he delivered the first of those in July of 1918. It was a twin-motor biplane carrying a bomb load of 1,500 pounds. In 1921, this experimental bomber sank a battleship, cruiser, and a destroyer, and several submarines as well, in work that Glenn Martin had with General Billy Mitchell. Mitchell was convinced that the U.S. needed air superiority after World War I, and he and Glenn Martin worked on this experiment and sank those ships off the Virginia Capes. From his work with Billy Mitchell, Glenn Martin went on to enormous success between the wars. He and his partners in Cleveland had different views of what was ahead, and eventually Martin decided to buy them out. Martin manufacturing was on the rise, and Glenn Martin knew that he needed more opportunities and had his men scouring the East Coast to find the right setting for an expanded operation. Perhaps the most avid pursuers of Glenn Martin were the bankers and politicians in Baltimore, Maryland. Glenn Martin knew that he needed to be closer to Washington, D.C., closer to his clients, and on a piece of the American landscape that provided lowlands for tidal operations. After World War I, the U.S. Navy was a major client of Martin Manufacturing. The Navy needed planes that could operate on land or at sea. Martin and his men had decided that they would find property in the mid-Atlantic region, and they began intensive negotiations with the city of Baltimore. Ultimately, Martin Manufacturing and Baltimore's leaders could not come to an agreement on the amount of land and financing that Martin Manufacturing required for its growth. And while those negotiations were underway, Martin and his men set up an extensive surreptitious operation where they began to acquire tidal lands just on Baltimore's eastern edge, outside the city's boundaries, in an area called Middle River, Maryland. By the end of 1928, Martin and his men had acquired almost 1,300 acres of land in Middle River, and construction was underway in 1929 for the expansion of Martin Manufacturing and what became the production center for the B-26, the Martin Marauder. The plane where the Silver King sat in the nose, the greenhouse, and became a decorated bombardier in the United States Army Air Corps. And as we prepare to return to our hero, the Silver King, and his letters, dearest ones, throughout his war, we have reached the end of this special edition on the history of Glenn L. Martin and Martin Manufacturing. Martin Manufacturing, which began in a vacant church in Santa Ana, California in 1909, and went on to incorporate in Los Angeles in 1912, and move to Cleveland in 1918, and on to Baltimore in 1928. Traveled through the rest of the 20th century to merge with Lockheed manufacturers in 1995 to become what is today Lockheed Martin. And you are listening to the Silver King's War.